This upload shall be a tribute to 1983's Krull, directed by Peter Yates, a glorious piece of 1980s fantasy featuring superlative cinematography from the excellent Peter Suschitzky. Fresh off of photographing The Empire Strikes Back, Suschitzky helped shape one of the most vivid and enchanting fantasy visions of its decade, elevating an otherwise somewhat generic screenplay into one of the most visually confident and eloquently realised acts of the genre on screen. I mean, mostly, right? The Slayers are a bit clunky in their movement, although their art design is fairly interesting. I love the fantasy visions of the 1980s, that post-Star Wars desire to compose these enormous and believable, lived-in and luminous fantasy worlds on screen. The other film which Krull is certainly downstream of is 1981's Excalibur, directed by the great John Borman. Krull I have an immense soft spot for. It is the perfect pastiche of these films, obviously not as truly quality as Excalibur, or as purely impressive as Legend, or imaginative as The Dark Crystal, maybe not even as ridiculously fun as The Beastmaster, or even as cinematically creative as Lucio Fulci's Conquest, although I adore its existence. I love sword and sorcery, D&D indulgence, so much more than people around me can understand. It is a realm wherein you can do anything, enchant anything, prance around and compose familiar yet imaginatively elastic texts within a comfortable, green, safe framework. I'd like to read out excerpts from the Wikipedia article of Krull. Is this quite lazy? Well, yes, though the thing is this, the article is needlessly, well, not needlessly in my opinion, needlessly well detailed, with a lot of information regarding the production history and the subsequent reception, to the present day, of this wonderful picture we call Krull. And I suspect that as a result of such excessive detail, this article will be edited down, as Krull may not be deemed by the powers that be as worthy of such impassioned exploration. I suppose the passion is the element which they have issue with. Once more, passion is our tragic, ruthless downfall. So let me read some of this out whilst we observe among the finest screen caps in FODD history. Krull is a 1983 science fantasy swashbuckler film directed by Peter Yates and written by Stanford Sherman. It follows a journey of Prince Colwyn and his gang of outlaws on the planet Krull to save future Queen Princess Lissa from the Beast and his constantly teleporting Black Fortress. The film stars an ensemble cast including Kenneth Marshall as Prince Colwyn, Lysette Anthony as Princess Lissa, Trevor Martin as the voice of the Beast, Freddie Jones as Ynir, Bernard Bresslaw as Rel the Cyclops, David Batley as Ergo the Magnificent, Tony Church and Bernard Archard as kings and the fathers of Colwyn and Lissa, Alan Armstrong as the leader of a group of bandits that include early screen roles for actors Liam Neeson and Robbie Coltrane, John Welsh as the Emerald Seer, Graham McGrath as Titch, and Francesca Annis as the Widow of the Web. Development on the film began in 1980 when Columbia Pictures president Frank Price gave producer Ron Silverman the idea to produce a fantasy film. Krull underwent a very expensive production process. The film's huge budget ballooned, mainly due to the designers having to make numerous alterations to the sets corresponding to the heavily evolving script. The movie was shot at several sound stages at Pinewood Studios. Actors such as Marshall, Bresslaw, and Jones performed dangerous stunts during filming. An international co-production of the United Kingdom and the United States, Krull was released in July 1983. The film was a box office bomb upon release, and critical opinion has been mixed, both upon release and in retrospect. Numerous reviewers have highlighted its visual effects and soundtrack, while several critics have criticized its plot as being derivative and nonsensical. The film has gone on to achieve cult film status. In 1980, Columbia Pictures president Frank Price asked producer Ron Silverman if he and his partner Ted Mann wanted to create a fantasy film. Silverman agreed to do so and hired Stanford Sherman, whose previously well-known writing credit was Any Which Way You Can, 1980, to work on the screenplay. He wrote the bare bones of the plot and sent it to Columbia, which they quickly approved. While the essence of the plot was never altered during development and production, the first draft of the film was titled The Dragons of Krull, where the beast was initially planned to be a dragon. However, the creators changed the beast to a more reptilian creature, as Sherwood described him for the final film, leading to the title change to simply Krull. The team also brought in Steve Tesich to write a second version of the script. Tesich's version of the screenplay was discarded as dialogue-heavy and lacking in special effects, so the first script was used and re-edited instead. There was one point in the writing process where it was planned that Lissa would turn into the antagonist near the end of the story, but this was not part of the final screenplay given that the production team didn't want her to be less than pure. Lysette Anthony, the actress who played Lissa, explained that she thought that was a little boring. After the first draft was finished, the writing and production team first considered Peter Yates to direct the film. 2 months after they asked him to join the project, and after he finished work on directing Eyewitness, 1981, Yates wrote the screenplay of The Dragons in Krull. He was intrigued with what he read and accepted the position of directing the film as a challenge. He reasoned in a 1983 interview that Krull would be one of those rare films that can take full advantage of today's special effects techniques and would differ from his more realistic previous works in that instead of having to research, he would have to make the movie entirely based on his imagination. The film was in a year of pre-production, which involved Sherman editing his script, Yates creating storyboards, Stephen B. Grimes and Derek Meddings coming up with and drawing set concepts, and Ken Marshall and Anthony being cast as Colwyn and Alyssa respectively. Despite persistent rumours that the film was meant to tie in with the game Dungeons & Dragons, Gary Gygax stated, "To the best of my knowledge and belief, the producers of Krull never approached TSR for a license to enable their film to use the D&D game IP." Yates described making Krull as complicated and just so enormous. Special effects artist Brian Johnson stated in a 2009 interview that Yates had hated working on the film so much that in the middle of shooting he took a vacation to the Caribbean, which led to the special effects artist taking a 3-week break from the project. The production was initially arranged to be shot at several locations because Krull was first planned as a medieval-style motion picture. However, as it went through multiple drafts, the screenplay transformed into a story that was entirely fantasy, which meant most of the film would be shot on sound stages and only a minority of the sequences would be filmed in actual locations in Italy and England for only a few weeks. A total of 23 huge sets of the film were built and shot at more than 10 sound stages at Pinewood Studios. Krull was a very expensive film to produce, using a budget of $30 million according to Starlog magazine. Marshall and Meddings reasoned that the huge budget was due to several changes of concepts in the script that led the designers to have to repeatedly alter the designs of the sets. Filming began on the 25th of January 1983. The first sequence shot was the scene where Ynir, Freddie Jones, climbs a huge spider web in order to confront the Widow of the Web. Jones did not use any safety wires because the wires would have been visible. Stop-motion animator Steve Archer, who previously worked on Clash of the Titans 1981, spent 2 weeks creating the first model of the spider in the scene which was later changed. Yates' direction of the action scenes that take place in the beginning of Krull was inspired by swashbuckler films such as Captain Blood 1935. However, he wanted to go through the complicated process of figuring out new weapons that gave the scenes a unique swashbuckling feel. Marshall practiced his moves for the sequences a week before filming of them began. However, by the time shooting of these scenes started, the costumes for the Slayers were recently finished. Therefore, much of the fight choreography was altered based on the limitations of the costumes at the last minute. Pinewood's 007 stage, one of the largest sound stages in the world, was used for the swamp scene of Krull, wherein the Slayers and several challenging changelings encounter Colwyn and his group. Yates would describe the swamp set as quite nasty, where we always had people bumping into things. It was filmed during what Marshall called a very harsh winter of 1983, and the set was too big to be entirely heated, leading to the actors feeling cold and exhausted. The crew members had a hard time seeing through the mist, which led to them accidentally getting into water that consisted of cork chips. Rehearsing the scene where Colwyn and his group are being chased by the Slayers in the Black Fortress involved stuntmen taking the part of Colwyn so that Marshall could conserve energy for final filming. It involved Colwyn and his men encountering a corridor where the floor opened underneath them via 2 set pieces, the size of a small house that were powered by liquid and broke apart before quickly slamming back together. Marshall explained that doing the sequence gave him nightmares after it was completed. When shooting of the scene began, Marshall took more time to say his lines than the production crew expected, leading to him not making it from the tunnel in the first take. Only one crew member noticed this and was able to stop the machines controlling the plate pieces, but Marshall explained that he knew that if the machines didn't stop in 5 seconds, he would be dead. Another take of the sequence was shot the next day with Yates instructing that the speed of the machine be slower. However, Marshall insisted on the machine being sped up, and in the final take was successful in getting away from the 2 set pieces alive. Marshall explained, "I had no feeling in my heel for months afterward. It was really hard doing stunts afterwards, too." Meddings, who was previously known for his work on Superman 1978 and Superman 2 1980, led the special effects department of Krull. British artist Christopher Tucker was also originally in the project but left due to creative differences. Nick Maley and his crew produced several effects 6 weeks before filming began. The effects department of Krull went for challenges in making visual effects and designs that were unusual to achieve in the early 1980s. Meddings described how the special effects were made for the movie. "It was a hard show in terms of effects. But whenever you do an effects pitch, you try to come up with something new. Unfortunately, you don't always succeed. You may think you've done something amazing, but ultimately it's up to the audience for that verdict. We really worked ourselves silly on this one, though." Meddings created miniatures for the setting of the film's titular planet. The model Meddings constructed for Lyssa's castle was 20 feet high. Shots of it were done in Italy using forced perspective to make it look taller than it really was. The design of the Black Fortress had a height of 12 feet, and an electrical system was used to create the light within it. Because the Black Fortress disintegrates at the end of the film, it was constructed like a jigsaw puzzle with parts able to be pulled apart on cue. In Krull, Urgo uses his magic to transform into creatures such as puppies and geese. Beddings used an effect strategy that showed these transformations differently from traditional cross-dissolve methods, reasoning that it had been done to death. He explained, "We did it with a series of blow-ups embellished with artworks so that you could actually blend in the actor. The actor, David Batley, dropped down to his knees and we used a series of blow-ups to reduce him to puppy size. Then, halfway through the transition, we introduced blow-ups of the puppy, blending the two sets together with artwork. Then, as the last still went on screen, we substituted the real dog who just wagged his tail and walked away. It was a trick, but it looks quite magical." 40 slayers are made for the film, the first 20 made in only 10 days. The fire mares, steeds that travel so fast they leave a trail of flame and can effectively fly, are played by Clydesdale horses. Stuntmen are responsible for being in shots that involved characters jumping off horses. One of them is seen in the film jumping off a cliff but failing to land on a horse. The film made over $16.5 million in the US, failing to bring back its reported budget of $27 to $30 million. However, it has gained a cult following over the years since its release. Variety called Krull a blatantly derivative hodgepodge of Excalibur meets Star Wars. They conclude that the professionalism of director Peter Yates, the large array of production and technical talents, and particularly the mainly British actors, keep things from becoming genuinely dull or laughable. Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel, reviewing Krull on their show At the Movies, gave the film 2 thumbs down and called it one of the most boring, nonsensical, illogical fantasies in a long time. Oh, that's a disgrace. Christopher John reviewed Krull in Aries magazine number 16 and commented that it is a hot, hollow wind which only reminds us of what a pleasant breeze feels like and angers us because it isn't one. Colin Greenland reviewed Krull for Imagine magazine, stated that if as much attention had been paid to the plot as to the visuals, instead of all this "it is the time, we must go, stay alone, together" stuff, perhaps it wouldn't be so hard to care what happens next. Critic Janet Maslin found Krull to be a gentle, pensive sci-fi adventure film that winds up a little too moody and melancholy for the Star Wars set, praising director Yates for giving the film poise and sophistication as well as a distinctly British air, and also bringing understatement and dimension to the material. Baird Seals described Krull as an unpretentious movie with a lot of good things going for it. A retrospective review by AllMovie journalist Jason Buchanan hailed it as an ambitious sci-fi fantasy that, even in its failures, can usually be forgiven for its sheer sense of bravado. Ryan Lambie, reviewing for Den of Geek in 2011, called it among the most visually creative and downright fun movies of the enchanted 80s, and a well-made film, and an entire galaxy away from the other cheap, quickly made knockoffs that showed up in the wake of Star Wars. In a 2006 retrospective article, Pop Matters critic Bill Gribben opined that, though finding many problems with Krull, it had an amusement amalgamation rare for a film released in the early 1980s, where if you don't like one particular character or circumstance, just wait, something completely different is just around the corner. He summarised that it's the perfect pick-up film, a movie you can catch in snatches while it plays on some pay cable channel. No matter what point you come in on the story, no matter what sort of scene is playing out before you, the lack of continuity and context actually allows you to take pleasure in the individual moment, and if so inclined, to stick around for another exciting sample in just a few minutes. Writing about the film in 2009, Eric D. Snyder summarised, "Against all odds, Krull crams itself with magic, fantasy, and heroic quests. It still manages to be boring. This is an impressive feat in and of itself. You'd almost have to be doing it on purpose." A common critical praise of Krull was the visuals and special effects. Lambie described them as quite captivating. Buchanan wrote, "Even if it does seem overly familiar at times, there is just enough originality injected into the visualization of the film that it's hard to dismiss as just another Star Wars clone." Seals called the film very beautiful, in fact a neglected quality in these days when it seems to have been forgotten that film is a visual medium. Entertainment Weekly stated that Krull had visual imagination to spare, including its sequences of flame-hoofed horses and a particularly scary pre-Lord of the Rings segment of a giant spider. Lambie called the glaive one of the coolest fantasy armaments of the decade, while Buchanan described it as highly original. However, Watt Evans disliked the naming choice of the weapon. He explained that an actual glaive was a sort of polearm, a long stick with a long blade on the end, and not a brass starfish. He stated that while glaive was a vague term and there wasn't an actual word that defined the weapon, the writer should have made another name up rather than borrowing one which doesn't fit. The effects have also garnered detractors. The House Next Door critic Stephen Boone stated that Krull stands out because it has some of the clunkiness and uncertain production design of a cheapie like Beastmaster, but its visuals fairly pulse like something from the Spielberg-Lucas realm. Gribben wrote that the film doesn't have the polished level of visuals that fans were used to, thanks to American companies like ILM. In a 2001 DVD Talk review, Gil Yates called the effects totally fake and funny like most other 1980s films. Ian Nathan, in a 2015 Empire magazine piece, wrote that they may have satisfied young boys at the time but have become frail and silly with age. He was especially critical towards the visuals of the ending, labelling them as all too derivative, lacking polish, and only mildly distracting. However, Nathan also noted that the film did present some interesting designs and concepts, including doppelgangers that sneak into Colwyn's gang and a witch named the Widow of the Web, trapped in the heart of a web. A frequent criticism in multiple reviews of Krull is its writing. Lambie believed that Krull is perhaps a little too derivative to earn a place in the major league of 80s fantasy movies. Gibran described Krull as a forgettable battle between good, evil, and a strange circular weapon, stating that its confusing mythology left many an intended audience member scratching their adolescent head. This confusing mythology included the dopey reasons for the story's essential characters dying and parts of the story that got lost inside all manner of interstellar/medieval malarkey. Writer Annie Frisbee opined the film's representation of the relationship between Colwyn and Lissa was way too vague, reasoning that the dialogue between Colwyn and Lissa is so generic that it doesn't come close to achieving that odd blend of universality and intimacy that makes love stories sing. Snyder described Krull as a film that dares you not to laugh at it, opining that its plot reads like an old report on Lord of the Rings given by a student who hasn't read the book. Snyder described one major problem in the film's writing. We're constantly told that there's one way to do something and that it's very dangerous, and that when the characters fail to do so, there's suddenly another way that is also very dangerous, and if that way fails too, you can bet there will be yet another way to do the thing that there was originally only one way to do. To use a screenwriting metaphor, this is like painting yourself into a corner and then avoiding stepping on the fresh paint by suddenly developing the ability to levitate. Many aspects of the plot, such as magical abilities, wizards, lands, and members of Krull's population, are only mentioned by the characters but never elaborated, which was both praised and criticised in Watt Evans' review of the film. He liked that it made the viewer have to solve mysteries on his own and gave the film believability. However, he was negative towards one scene in the film where Lissa sees a projected image of the beast murdering a girl. We see the image of the girl die and vanish, but I would have liked to look at that directly, rather than through the image. How did it look to the people around the girl? Did she vanish as the image did, or was there a body? He described this part of the film as a missed opportunity, reasoning that such a scene would have told us something about the beast's power, and the reactions of the people watching might have been informative as well. He said Krull drags in spots, such as in the moments Colwyn and his gang climb mountains, and described the film's ending as singularly lacking in surprises. However, Lambie praised the ending for being the most exciting part of the film, as well as surprisingly harsh, with Colwyn losing allies at every turn. The Star Wars franchise never dispatched quite so many characters in such a graphic manner. Responses towards the characters and performances of Krull were varied. Some critics praised the antagonists of the film. Watt Evans has highlighted the Slayer's cleverly designed double-ended weapons, which provide some nice special effects and make for wonderfully chaotic battle scenes. He also noted they squeal and glow before they break apart when they get stabbed, describing it as quite alien and frightening. Lambie praised the Slayer's ominous silhouette of their armour, and the worm-like creature that erupts from them when they're defeated, making them far less derivative than they may have otherwise been. Buchanan described the Slayers as truly horrific, calling their death screams a memorable touch, and labelled the beast as being pulled straight from the darkest of fairy tales. The Aurum Film Encyclopedia expressed admiration for the engaging characters who surround the pallid hero and heroine, and also called the action scenes nicely judged. Lambie called the characters flat. Gibran said that the acting seemed pitched just a tad too high for the relatively lowbrow material, while Buchanan described Marshall's performance as Colwyn as somewhat wooden. Yates opined that Marshall, who looks like the love child of Patrick Swayze and Bruce McCulloch, is not quite tough enough to pull off his warrior role, but the supporting cast seems more solid. Lambie praised David Batley's performance as Ergo, while Justine Elias, another journalist for The House Next Door, called Batley's character awful, elaborating that even the dullest child would find this unfunny. I pitied Ken Marshall when he was forced to react with hearty ha-ha has to every crap magic trick. Combining elements of sword and sorcery in the space opera genre, Krull has a plot compared by critics to the works in the series of Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, and, for its use of the glaive, The Legend of King Arthur. Watt Evans explained that the glaive is just there, waiting for the right man to come and wield it. Though most of the characters say they know about the myths of the glaive, they never reveal these stories to Colwyn before he obtains the weapon. He wrote, "Do any of the stories even ever bother to explain who forged Excalibur or how? No, it's just there, waiting for Arthur to come and get it. Similarly, the glaive is just there, waiting for Colwyn." Starlog critic Lawrence Watt Evans analogized the look, story, and vibe of Krull as a superior version of The Dark Crystal, 1982. He described the film settings, basically medieval in appearance. Krull has a sort of streamlined look in places, as if perhaps the Sith civilization is more technologically advanced than it appears on the surface. The Black Fortress and everything connected with it has a broken, vaguely organic look to it, as if it were grown instead of built, and then cut to shape where it hadn't grown right. The interior is quite weird, and seems to be constantly shifting to suit the whims of the beast. Yates' concept for Krull was sort of a fairy storybook that moves, a fairy tale with a life, a reality of its own. I very much wanted to make a movie of some old-fashioned romance to it, yet a movie where things always moved. Watt Evans, characterizing Krull as a fairy tale, noted the film to be mythic to the point of having no attempt at realism. He analysed Lyssa and Colwyn, despite having apparently arranged the marriage for political reasons, fall madly in love at first sight. He continued, although we're told that the Slayers have been burning villages, we never see a village burned or otherwise. He wrote that establishing shots of castles show no residents or plot unrelated to extras passing by. This was an indication that the lands of Krull do not have an economic system or population, which is appropriate given that it's traditional for the heroes of fairy tales to be unbothered by such necessities as food and shelter. He wrote that not much about the background of the characters is revealed because this is not a film that explores the innermost secrets of the human heart, it's a glorious fairy tale for both adults and children. None of the characters who live on Krull explain the magical powers they use every day. Watt Evans wrote that this lack of explanation helps one to accept that these people are real people living in a real world. He reasoned that magic powers are Krull's equivalent of automobiles. In a movie set on Earth, does anyone bother to explain cars? No, they're just there. For Krull, magic is as much a part of the everyday world as automobiles are for us. Lawrence Watt Evans of Starlog noted that the beast is not clearly visible and can be seen only through various distortions, as if he isn't quite a part of normal three-dimensional space at all. This particular shot of Rel, the Cyclops, this moment in particular really moves me. I love the visual of this shot. It reminds me of this is the cozy. It's this realm wherein the lighting, the fantasy imagination, the physicality of it, the fact that it evokes this beautiful fantasy realm, just the idea of both what Krull means as like a prospective idealistic child viewer and as a absolutely free of insecurity, do whatever you want, adult viewing Krull. This shot of Rel the Cyclops blinking in this particular frame, it encapsulates the magic of the film and what I consider to be, it evokes the idea of like a night garden, and when you're done in the garden, you go upstairs and you watch Krull. Well, it's more than that. Rel's in the garden, he's giving you wisdom, and then you go upstairs and you watch Krull. It is heaven in a sense, actually. It's a bizarre thought, but wow. Thanks all. Have a great night.